Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to, or morning, depending where you're calling in from. Welcome to another episode of Library Lunch and Learn. This is the one we always find to be very exciting. We hold it for the end of the year, mostly because this is the time of year most of us are thinking about food the most, whether it's because we're starting to get a little chill from the summer being over, or to plan for the holidays, or because some of us just like food all the time, which is me. Um, we are happy for you to be at our Cooking and Culinary Stories edition. We have another wonderful lineup as always. Miriam and I were just talking about how we never planned on being television stars, but here we are. So we're glad again. We have a great lineup today, as always. And I will have Miriam introduce herself and our first guest for today from the New York Public Library. We're so excited about your presentation, Rebecca. Thank you for being here. I will have Miriam do your formal introduction, but thanks everybody. A few housekeeping things really quickly, sorry. Just as a note, this is recorded. We send the recording out after to everybody that attends or to everybody that's registered. So if we say something about a website or a resource, you don't have to feel like you have to scribble it down on a piece of paper. We send it all out in the wrap-up report, and any links that you need, we will also add into the wrap-up report as well. And also, we like this to be conversational. So if you do have any questions during Rebecca's or Alex's talk at the end, please put them into the chat or into the Q&A, and we will get to them if we can. All right, enjoy the program. I hope everybody has a great lunch planned for after, because I think we're going to all be hungry. So, all right, thanks. Over to you, Miriam.
Thank you, Kelly, and welcome everyone. It's such a pleasure to see you all here. Thank you so much for joining us for this program, which is really aimed to introduce library staff to illuminating books and support your reference and readers advisory work, as well as collection development and library programming. As Kelly mentioned, this special program is focusing on cooking and culinary stories. And because of this, we extended an invitation to our good friend and colleague at the New York Public Library, Rebecca Federman. She is the Assistant Director of the General Research Division and the Center for Research in the Humanities at the New York Public Library. Deeply involved with the library's culinary collections, Rebecca was the project co-manager for the library's menu transcription platform, What's on the Menu, and she co-curated in 2012 the amazing exhibition Lunch Hour New York City. Please welcome Rebecca Federman.
Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Kelly, for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here and to speak to all of you about something that I love so much, which is not only the library, but anything food related. So I'm going to talk about the library's culinary collections and also some of the works that have been created using these materials by scholars and researchers, because that's the whole reason we have them, is to create new knowledge for people to read books about these collections. So Kelly, I think we should start with the first slide. So this is a sandwich. And I'll talk a little bit about this picture in a little bit. This is part of our Automat collection. But before I proceed with the next slide, I kind of want to set the stage as to how I got introduced to the library's collections. It was kind of it wasn't by accident, but it was 2002, and I had just started at library school. And I was enrolled in Pratt Institute in New York, and I had been to the 42nd Street Library, which is the next slide. I'd been to this library maybe once, but I didn't really understand how it worked. And I was in library school, and I thought, I really need to understand how this building works. I should spend more time in it. And so, as luck should have it, there was an exhibition on display at the time, which is the next slide, which is called New York Eats Out. And this was back in 2002 into 2003. And it was curated by the former New York Times restaurant critic, William Grimes. And the exhibition was basically just a display of menus from the library's collections. And he displayed menus from the library's collections that spoke to the history of dining out in New York, both high-end and low-end. So there was, in the next slide, you'll see a menu from Delmonico's and a photo of Delmonico's. I had never heard of Delmonico's at the time. This is a big 19th century restaurant, Gilded Age restaurant that was extremely popular. And the minute you start reading about food and food history, it comes up frequently. There was information about Schraff's, which is the next slide. Schraff's is, I grew up eating Schraff's ice cream, vanilla ice cream, and I knew that my mother had gone to Schraff's as a working woman in New York, but I had never really seen a Schraff's menu or seen what a Schraff's looks like. And the menu for this Schraff's is actually a photo, not a photo, it's a picture of the library itself. And I just really didn't understand. I was kind of both delighted and perplexed. I had no idea that the library collected things like menus. I had no idea that a building and a sort of august, institution like the New York Public Library would collect things that were so familiar to me, like a restaurant menu. I'd been to restaurants, I'd held menus in my hand, I knew what they were. And I knew that, my mom had gone to Schraff's, my parents knew these restaurants, and it felt very immediate, and I felt very sort of connected to the library. And I was very excited about the idea of what these menus could tell us. And I just got very excited about the library as a whole. And it definitely sort of made me feel closer to a piece of history than I had looking at a rare book or a manuscript. It felt very immediate to me. And then through some circumstances of happy accidents, I was able to have an internship at the library and then eventually a job here. And while I've had a few different positions, I've always tried to keep some sort of hand in the culinary collections as much as possible. The next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about the menu collection now, because the menu collection was what got me so interested in the library's collections in the first place. And here are a couple of menus, just a sampling. There are tens of thousands of menus in our collection. And as Miriam noted, many of them have been digitized. All of these, for example, are digitized, and these are available on our What's on the Menu page and also on our digital collections page, which I could talk about later. But this just gives you sort of a sampling of the kinds of things and in our collection. There's a Tavern on the Green menu. There's a Ratner's menu, which is a restaurant on the Lower East Side. There's a Caliente Cab Company Mexican restaurant, which I used to go to when I was a teen. And then there's actually an Empire Szechuan Gourmet takeout menu. And for those of you who may have read Jenny Aitley, who was another former New York Times reporter, she wrote a book called Fortune Cookie Chronicles, and she actually references the Empire Szechuan Gourmet restaurant because there were a couple of them, but there was one on 97th and Broadway near Upper West Side. And it was considered, and this is the menu from that location, and it was considered sort of the first, it wasn't the first Chinese restaurant to offer delivery, but from what she says, it was the first restaurant to really offer not only free delivery, but really advertise their delivery services to buildings in the neighborhood, and which is such a sort of ubiquitous New York experience, have, Chinese takeout restaurant menus. And Empire Szechuan Gourmet was the first one to do that. So that's part of our collection as well. Next slide. There are a lot of things that you can learn by looking at menus. And you can learn about the history of a certain neighborhood, like Empire Szechuan Gourmet, and the history of a certain restaurant. This is an interesting look at class differences among passengers on the Lusitania. This is the same meal on the same day, but the difference is one is a first class menu, one is the second class menu, and one is a third class menu. And you can look at the differences in terms of how they're designed. You can look at the differences in the kinds of food that is offered. You can see that the first class bill of fare has many more fruits on offer than the second class and definitely the third class. The third class bill of fare includes all the meals on one menu, where the first class bill of fare just has a very large offering of different breakfast foods. So this is just one example of the way people have come to the library to look at how these documents tell us about what was happening on board and what people were actually eating. If you notice a sort of offensive stamp in the middle, that was the stamp of the woman who collected the menus, who sort of, her work comprised a lot of the work of the menus that are in the collection. Her name was Miss Butov, and she started collecting menus for the New York Public Library in 1900. She was never an employee of the library, but she sort of volunteered her time and her efforts to amass this enormous collection of menus. And it's unclear how much interest she actually had in the food. I think she really liked being part of this institution and feeling like she was contributing something. And she definitely did contribute quite a bit. Unfortunately, many of them are stamped, which we would never do now. And if you look at some of the later menus that were added to the collection after she left, you won't find stamps on them. But if you're curious about what those stamps are, that is the official stamp of Ms. Butov. The next slide, please. These are some of my favorite types of menus. These are sort of pictograms, and you can see how different menus sometimes use words and photos and images differently. These are just a couple of examples of ways you can kind of, from having a large collection, you can kind of look at the collection as a whole and gather the different kinds of menus in a way that you can't do when you have a smaller collection. I know that's obvious, but so sometimes we sort of try to create, sort of look at the different menus and sort of organize them by category and think about ways that researchers might use them for their own research or ways of being inspired. A lot of the menus are consulted by people who are interested in either opening their own restaurant or just want to get inspired by the kinds of cuisine that was offered, or who are interested in more graphic design elements of menus and how menus used to look versus how they look today. Although the Kachi Roll Company menu is probably only about 5 or 6 years old. Next slide. So these are two examples of menus that are associated with the New York World's Fair in 1939-1940 that was held in Queens, New York. And this is on the left, you have the French Pavilion restaurant, and I love this image. And then on the right, you have the USSR Pavilion, which has a wonderful note at the bottom that talks about how, you know, following Soviet custom, they do not accept tips. But these are part of the New York World's Fair. And the one aspect of the menu collection and about the culinary collection as a whole is that while the menus are fascinating to look at, and like the Lusitania, you can really get a lot of information just by looking at these individual documents. By looking at the library's collections more, if you sort of zoom out and look at the library's collections as a whole, not just ones that are associated with food, you get a much better understanding of sort of culinary history. That culinary history and researching food history doesn't necessarily just happen with quote unquote food documents like menus and cookbooks, but oftentimes you have to sort of provide the larger context of what was happening in order to get an understanding of what was being, you know, what was on the menu itself or in these cookbooks. And these are two examples. We have the New York World's Fair papers in the library's collections. And the next slide. And we also have other images from the library. So on the right, you see the Soviet Pavilion, which is part of the World's Fair collection. On the left is the French Pavilion, which is a postcard in another part of our collection. So oftentimes when people come in and they say, I'm interested in doing culinary research, they're not necessarily interested in doing, or their needs necessarily aren't met by looking at cookbooks or restaurant menus, but their needs might be met by looking at archival papers, or by looking at postcards, or by looking at guidebooks, or by looking at novels. And everything is sort of related to everything else. And that's one of the biggest takeaways that I've gotten from working here, is that I've learned more about sort of food history by looking at the larger collections, because in a humanities library, we document how people live and how people work and how people live their lives, and food is such an integral part of everyone's life, hopefully, that these documents really tell us a lot more. So the French Pavilion, if you head to the next slide, has an interesting history, because the French Pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair was an extremely popular pavilion. It brought a lot of celebrities, and it was booked, and people were going there specifically for the food at the French Pavilion. And all the chefs had come from France. But then World War II started, and they didn't want to go back. And so they stayed, and many of them stayed in New York and opened Le Pavillon, named after the pavilion. And this restaurant became one of the most famous of the high-end sort of French restaurants in New York City. It attracted the Kennedys, came to Le Pavillon, different celebrities came. Jacques Pepin started at Le Pavillon when he came from France. And I would say of all the menus in the collection, the one that gets asked for the most by chefs to consult is Le Pavillon. It's sort of the holy grail of menus that they all want to see, especially if they're doing a sort of a high-end cuisine. So we're happy to have this as part of our collection. And I love that there's a legacy that extends back to the World's Fair papers that we also have in our collection. So they're all sort of together and connected in that way. The next slide, please. So these are just a sampling of some of the books that have been written using the library's collections, among many others, obviously. There's Repast, which is looking at dining out at the dawn of the new American century, which is really looking at 19th and early 20th century restaurants. There is The 10 Restaurants That Changed America, that was written a few years ago by Paul Friedman, who is someone who has used the library's collections quite a bit in his research, and focuses on many restaurants, including, well, 10, including Delmonico's. And you see that picture of Delmonico's on the cover that I referenced in the first slide. And then Turning the Tables, which is looking at American middle class and restaurants in that period, which is an area of research that hasn't necessarily gotten as much attention as sort of the books that talk about the higher end cuisines. So that was also written in large part referencing the library's collections for Andrew's research. Next slide, please. So these are a couple of other examples. On the bottom are chefs who consulted the library's collections to look at the Four Seasons in launching the new grill at the Four Seasons, which is a very high-end restaurant in Midtown. And they consulted a lot of the archival work of the Four Seasons and the menus of the Four Seasons to get inspiration, not copy, obviously, the original menu, but to get inspiration for their current iteration. And then here are a couple of other ways that people have used the library's collections. The one on the top left was this collection, this marine biologist from Texas A&M University had consulted the menus back in the early 2000s to look at fish populations around the waters of New York City by looking at what menus served, what New York City-based menus served of the fish, what fish was served, and then looking at the fish population. And then more recently, this is, I think, 2018, the North Fork History Project was looking at the scallop industry on Long Island and what a rich history it has. And then they were looking at the various menus in our collection to see what restaurants in that same time period were serving scallops and how they were serving them, and if there was any reference to the fact that they came from, or they would have come from the North Fork. So all of these researchers are using menus in sort of various and unexpected ways. And to us, that's the most exciting part of working in a library, is working with researchers to see how they're able to use our collections to make new works. Next slide, please. So I can't talk about the library's collections without talking about the Automat, which is another collection we have here. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Automat was a restaurant sort of chain of automatic restaurants that started in the early 20th century in Philadelphia. And then spread to New York, where it was really popular. So it was only really in those two cities. And basically, it's a coin-operated system where you enter a coin into a slot that advertises whether it's, pumpkin pie or tomato soup or, baked beans. You turn a knob, and then you're able to pull the item right from the system. And it was very, very popular. It lived large in the imaginations of many people. I think people really thought it was somehow magical. I was talking to my uncle recently who was talking about how much he loved going to the Automat. People talked about going to the Automat and really just getting some hot water and the free lemon and making lemonade, or getting the hot water and the free ketchup and making tomato soup. It wasn't very expensive. The food was really, really high quality, and the business was called Horn and Hard Art. And the library is fortunate enough to have the Horn and Hard Art papers in our collection. And archival papers are obviously the sort of richest areas of research, because you have both the history of the organization and then the documents. You have the letters, you have the photographs, you have the recipes. This is a Bernice Abbott photo of the Automat. And this was, we found an old Automat for our lunch hour exhibition that Miriam referenced at the beginning, that we refurbished for the lunch hour exhibition, and it was extremely popular. And we tried to find the recipes and put the recipes in the slots because we couldn't get the food, obviously, because we're a library. Next slide. So here is a menu. So in addition to the slots, there were some dining rooms at Horn and Hard Art, and they're morphed into cafeterias along the way. This photo is great, and we don't have many restaurant archival collections, and a lot of restaurants that I've spoken to don't really keep a lot of their papers. What I love about these photos is that not only are they telling researchers what the restaurant itself looked like, but they're also telling you what people were wearing in that time. And oftentimes when now people take pictures of the interiors of restaurants, they don't include what anybody eating there. And so part of, you could look at a lot of these collections for the purposes of fashion research just as much as you could for culinary research. Next slide. So this is a piece of pie, obviously, and the sandwich that started the slideshow also was from the Horn and Hard Art papers. What we found so wonderful is that there weren't many pictures of the food that we found among the collections of the many, many boxes of the Horn and Hard Art papers, but there were a couple, and we got very excited, even though this was clearly not touched by a food stylist. It gives you a real sense of what the food and what the pie looked like. And by all accounts, it was extremely delicious. We know a little bit about how good the food must have been, because on the right, you see 4 images from the manager's booklet, which was a huge book that was given to every Automat location, and they were all over New York City. The last one closed in 1991, I believe, or 1990. And they give you instructions on how to make the perfect cup of coffee. They give you instructions on just how much whipped cream to put on, the strawberry shortcake. They give you very exacting instructions on every piece of the food that your customers would be eating. And it was all fresh. It was all freshly made in a commissary and all delivered by trucks throughout the city. So there are clues, even though we're not there to be able to taste the food, and we can't always rely on the memories of people who went, you can kind of get a sense of how good the food was just by the directions that the company gave to its employees and how seriously they took the preparation of the food. Next slide, please. And just recently, this opened this past year, as a matter of fact. There was a researcher named Lisa Hurwitz who spent quite a bit of time in the library's collections and interviewing various Automat devotees, including Mel Brooks, who you see here on the poster, for a documentary that, that opened this year called The Automat. And I believe it is streaming on various streaming channels. So if any of you are interested, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful film. It's very rich and very nostalgic, but also extremely informative and fascinating. So that is another, not, you know, people write books obviously and articles, but it's wonderful when things like movies and documentaries are created using the library's collections as well. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to briefly talk about some of the other collections at the library that aren't necessarily specifically food related. And these are some images of pretzel vendors in New York, again, some of which was, you know, featured in the lunch hour exhibition. So back 10 years ago already, there was an exhibition that I worked on with Laura Shapiro, who's a culinary historian, on the history of lunch in New York. And one of the priorities for us when we were talking about the exhibition was we wanted to really look at how people spent their midday meal. And it wasn't so much what they ate, although that was part of it, but it was also about the kinds of experiences that one had with food, either on the street, in the classroom, or in the cafeteria, at the workplace, at home. And the sort of larger context of how industrialization changed how a midday meal was perceived. And this is one, these are some WPA images on the left and on the right. And then in the middle, there's a photo of pretzel vendors. And for those in New York or who visit New York, there's always this sort of the pretzel vendors on the street corner. They smell really good, and you get a hot pretzel. And the pretzel vendors go back quite a ways, but the pretzels didn't really go up in price. They were pretty much 20 cents. I'm sorry, they were less than 20 cents. I think it was like 10 cents or less up until the 1920s. So they were really inexpensive, and as a result, a lot of the pretzel vendors themselves were not necessarily regarded as some of the other vendors on the street or other food purveyors would be. So they were sort of looked at disapprovingly, and also pretzels were often associated with drinking because they were salty beverages that were often served at bars and saloons to get people thirsty. And so these are some images that sort of depict what the experience would have been like, or how artists saw pretzel vendors throughout history. And so these are other images that sort of, you get a sense of the food of New York or other places through not just the restaurant menus and the cookbooks, but also through imagery. Next slide. This is another example in our collection. This is around the same time during the Depression, people who were unemployed would sell apples for 5 cents each. And we have examples of apple vendors. So it's telling a different sort of side of food history that isn't, necessarily about consuming food and what you're eating, but also how people sold food and what those experiences were like on the other end, for people who needed to sell food to make a living, and what that looked like. We see the sort of, apples is, selling apples is sort of this iconic image of the Depression, and you can see what it looks like in our collection. This is a photo, and then looking at vendors, not vendors, sorry, this is Father Divine, who was a preacher in Harlem during the Depression, and he would have these wonderful banquets where he served free food to anyone who didn't have money and just a few cents to people who could afford to pay. These wonderful banquets with lots and lots of food. And again, this is at the height of the Depression when people were really hungry and needed food. And his followers thought he was God. He was named Father Divine. He was born George Baker. And there was a wonderful quote that said that when he poured the coffee, the pot never emptied. There was always plentiful food. And so this is part of the Schomburg collection, which is one of the NYPL research libraries. And just another example of how one could look at food in the Depression and look at other examples of how people were giving and the banquets that were held, and how food featured a huge part of these. Next slide. So I'm going to quickly go through, this is just a sampling. Cookbooks are obviously a huge part of the collection. These is just a sampling of the kinds of things we have. Next slide. And some people are coming in to look at the artistry of cookbooks, whether it's sort of the iconic, line drawings and, handwritten font of vegetarian cookbooks, or the wonderful artwork that is done in more artist cookbooks. So we tried to collect an example of lots of different kinds of cookbooks that people would want to consult for years to come. Not just looking for the food, but also looking to gain inspiration or to get a sense of the artistry. Next slide. And we also have magazines. This is actually, we have food magazines, but we also have magazines not related to food. This is actually a High Times magazine. This was from 1978, and this was the first article that was featured in High Times magazine, which is a magazine about marijuana. This was the first article they wrote about the consumption of eating marijuana, of using marijuana as an ingredient in food. And it's such an arresting image. And so there are many food columns in High Times that we've had researchers consult as well, especially as the changing laws around cannabis and what is the history of cooking with cannabis, especially as cookbooks about cannabis not only are in Barnes & Noble, but on many of our library shelves for books to check out. You never think it would have happened years ago. But here's an example of one of the sort of, the magazine about marijuana, writing about cannabis cooking and cannabis as an ingredient and cannabis consumption in 1978. Next slide. And also just going back to the archival work, we have archival papers that talk about food production. This is a recipe for tip-top bread and an image of tip-top bread, which was from the Ward Baking Company, which later became the Continental Baking Company, which produced Wonder Bread, among others. And so we have the records, they're called the Tally papers, and we have about 7 boxes that sort of document the Ward Baking Company into the Continental Baking Company and includes recipes. And so if you're interested in looking at industrial baking and bread and white bread and how they were marketed, all of that is part of archival papers, not necessarily going to be in a cookbook. Next slide. And here is also manuscript cookbooks as well. Here's something, a whiskey punch recipe from one of our manuscript cookbooks. So we do in our manuscript cookbook collection, we have lots of different recipes for lots of things, but alcohol and punches are one that oftentimes people are looking at a menu, finding punch recipes, and are interested in what a punch from that time period really would have tasted like. And so it's nice to be able to point to some of these other cookbooks and say, this is a contemporary recipe, and here's what it might have consisted of. And I believe this is the last slide. The last slide I just wanted to end with are 2 somewhat recent books. Salty is Alyssa Wilkinson, and this just came out earlier this year. And What She Ate came out a couple of years ago by Laura Shapiro, who I worked with at the library. These are sort of not traditional biographies. I was just interviewing them for a panel recently at the Brooklyn Book Festival. And what these books really illustrate that I find so fascinating and that shed light on sort of my philosophy about culinary research is that they are both books that document and sort of explore women's history through food. But what I love the most about them is that they don't necessarily just focus on chefs or cookbook writers, but they're also looking at women like Maya Angelou, Octavia Butler, Ava Braun, Barbara Pym, writers and authors, and you know, others like Ava Braun, and looking at how they can sort of pull the food stories of these women from their larger stories and their larger biography by poring over letters and by poring over diaries and looking at documents of the day and really giving you a sense of what sort of their food life was like, even though they're not sort of traditional food people. These books are really wonderful ways of exploring food through women's history and through biography in untraditional and sort of unexpected ways. So I just wanted to end with those two books as a great example of what I love most about food history, which is how it comes from lots of different places. That's all.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was so fun. I'm sure everybody really enjoyed that. I know I certainly did. That was such a fun historical trip through, you know, how restaurants have evolved, and I love seeing the pretzel vendors. All of that was so fun. And I can't help but think, not to use a food pun, that you and our next speaker are the most complementary paired speakers that we've had so far. So the work you put into this presentation was so fun, and what a great trip down memory lane. And I loved that Automat, what do you call those, exhibit at the library. I remember going to it, and I absolutely thought it was so fun and such a great way. You're right, like you know, to read something about people in history is one thing, but when you can use like food as it's a shared experience that everybody has, and it brings you back, you know, it's almost like a song, like something that you can relate to so personally, makes you feel like you've gotten to understand that time period a little bit better. And so I love all the research here and all the documents you shared with us. That was really fun. Miriam, do you want to ask Rebecca any questions before we let her go? But Rebecca, honestly, that was really fascinating and so fun.
Good, I'm glad. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I mean, you reference food stories and documents of the day and real time. We are still very much in a pandemic, and I was wondering if you would be able to share what kinds of inquiries, you know, food-related reference questions you might be receiving these days, or noticing any borrowing trends in terms of the kinds of cookbooks people are requesting at the library.
So, you know, during the pandemic, we were obviously closed, like all of us, all of the libraries. And so what we did was we relied heavily on email reference and on online consultations, which I know many of us around the country were doing. And I definitely received, there was a lot of interest in there was a question I remember about the sort of lives of chefs and sort of looking at sort of the chef as a figure, especially now that so many chefs are celebrities at this point. They're not just in the kitchen cooking behind the scenes, they're very much up front and center. So there were a couple of questions about sort of looking at chefs themselves and what works they could consult to help with that. And there are definitely questions about menus and about looking at, you know, various dishes on menus. We often thankfully, many of our menus have been digitized. And what's nice about the digitization is that you can, read them better. A lot of the menu font is very small, and so being able to refer people to an online version is great. So we get lots of different questions, and many of the questions, though, I have to say, aren't necessarily, their answer is often in places like newspapers. or they relate to sort of moments in it. It's not necessarily we're not going to find an answer in the cookbook, but we often have to go to a newspaper, for example, to see how something was documented, or if there was an event or there was an opening of a restaurant and how was it documented in the paper. So we end up using a lot of things like ProQuest, or we still use a lot of microfilm here. So we use microfilm a bit for things like the New York Post. That was probably, of all of the titles during the pandemic, the title that was most requested by people when we were closed by far was the New York Post.
Interesting. Wow.
It's not food related necessarily. It's just a curious piece of
Interesting.
information.
Thank you.
Well, thank you
Thank you
so
so
much. Thank you
much.
for joining us today. Thank you, Robin, for putting a resource in the chat about the documentary of the Automat. And now we're going to get on to our featured author. But again, Robin, thank you so much. And like we said, we'll send any information out in the wrap-up report. And we really appreciate all your work. And that was very fun and inspiring, and just a great way for us to have our last Lunch and Learn of the year. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thanks for including me. Take care. Bye.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Bye. All right. So, wow, that was fun. I honestly can't think of a better person to come on next after that presentation. Alex, we're going to get you on here. I think we have you on. You just have to turn on your camera and unmute yourself. While I introduce our guest of the program today, we are so thrilled to introduce you and to talk today to Alex Prud'homme. He is going to talk to us about his new book, Dinner with the, All the President's Table, Food, Politics, and a History of Breaking Bread at the White House. And sorry, Alex, we have your not final cover on here because we don't have a cover yet. So we'll let you talk about the real story with that and when it's coming out and all that stuff. And this is going to be a wonderful, entertaining, often surprising narrative of presidential food, from Washington's lack of it at Valley Forge to Trump's well-done steaks with ketchup. What they ate, why they ate it, and what it all means. And Alex Prud'homme is a freelance writer whose work has appeared in the New York Times. I know you all know who he is already, but I'm going to do the formal intro anyway because it's so impressive. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and other publications. He is the co-author of Julia Child's memoir, My Life in France, and has authored or co-authored The French Chef in America, The Ripple Effect, Hydrofracking, The Cell Game, and Forewarned. He lives in Brooklyn with his family, but he is in Washington, D.C. today. He's literally just jumped off of the Amtrak train. So maybe you might want to start with talking about the cuisine on Amtrak. Thank you for joining us today. We're so happy that you're here. Oh, let's just have you unmute yourself. Sorry.
There we are. You got it?
There you go.
Okay.
Hello, yes.
Yes, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Yes, I'm just off the train through the rain. We had a few technical difficulties, but here I am. It's very fitting that I'm here at the National Museum of American History, where Julia Child's kitchen is. So I've spent a lot of time here in this building, and in fact, they were very helpful in my research for this new book, Dinner with the President. So it's kismet that we're all here today.
Yeah, and before you start talking, I'd love to introduce you to my colleague Miriam Tullio, who used to be a New York Public Librarian as well. And now,
Oh, great. Hi, Miriam. Nice to meet you.
Hi. Welcome.
And I just want to let you know that I'm going to take the slides down because we'll let you talk so people can see you. We want to encourage you to put all the people that are on the program to please feel free to put questions in the chat. And I honestly, the way that Rebecca just talked about the history of food and how it brought, it brings people together and connects us all to the past in a way that not just reading a book can do. It really is just wonderful that you're going to be talking about what the presidents have eaten throughout history, and not just the food part of it, but the fact that it it changes so much during history, and it makes you know more about a person, and it's kind of just like this continuance of history. So what a perfect way to go into the next section here. Let me just try to get these down for you. All right, so Thank you
Good.
for being here today.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, maybe you could just start off by, telling us a little bit about the new book and how the research was different from what you've done in the past. And you know, did you use what archives did you use at certain libraries? And just maybe give us a little bit of a general idea of how this idea came to be.
Sure. Well, the way it came to be happened in sort of three parts. First of all, I grew up in a very foodie household. My great aunt was Julia Child, so I grew up with Julia and her husband Paul as presence in the home as much as on television. So I was very lucky to have that. But she wasn't the only good cook. My grandmother, my aunts, my mother, my uncle, they're all really good cooks. So I was spoiled, although I didn't realize it at the time. And we would sit around, and we were all kind of engaged. We would everybody would read the paper, and we'd have these big debates at the table, often about politics. And my father was a wonderful reader. He'd read voraciously all the time. And I was a history major. So I had this in the background, this interest in food and politics and history. I did a couple of books about Julia, as you mentioned, and in researching them, I discovered that Julia had actually come to the White House several times, most notably in 1967, when she was the first person to ever televise a state dinner. This was during LBJ's tenure, when Prime Minister Sato of Japan came, and it was a tough period. Johnson was in hiding almost because there was the Vietnam War going badly. There was rock and roll. There was racial strife. It was a tough time, but and he wasn't talking to the media much, and he was in his bunker. But Julia being Julia, she managed to charm him and Lady Bird, and lo and behold, they gave permission for Julia and Paul to come with a small crew from her station in Boston, WGBH, and film a behind-the-scenes look at what it takes to make a state dinner. Now, this was a very personal project for them because they had been State Department employees for many years after the Second World War, and they'd lived in Paris. That's where Julia learned how to cook, but also in Norway and Germany and in Washington. And so this was kind of a perfect project for them. And they understood it culinarily as well as sort of diplomatically. And their idea was to open up the White House to the American public. And the show was a huge hit. And 9 years later, they did it again in 1976 for the bicentennial, when Gerald Ford hosted Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip at this ultra, moment in time, the bicentennial. They had a big white tent on the south lawn of the White House, and everything was perfectly timed down to the minute until right before the ceremony began, a horrible rainstorm came in and knocked down everything, washed out the tents, and it was a disaster. But anyway, they regrouped and they went ahead and filmed it. And so I had done, and there's a lot of wonderful anecdotes within those two stories. But anyway, I was really intrigued by Julia bringing the American public to the White House. And, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, it'd be kind of fun to update that. So then in 2018, I think it was, or 2016 rather, I was invited to the White House to give a talk about a book I wrote about fresh water. And water, as we now know, is a very important and timely subject. And my contention in the book is that it will be the defining resource of this century. And so I was invited to the White House during the Obama years to talk to mid-level staff. It was a hot August day. I'd never done the White House tour, always wanted to. And a friend of mine who worked for the Obamas invited me for lunch to the Navy Mess, which is the little cafeteria on the ground floor. And so we had lunch, and then he gave me a quick tour, a private tour of the White House. The Obamas were off in Martha's Vineyard. And so we're walking through the White House. The lights are turned down, the rugs are rolled up. And suddenly history started coming alive for me, like right in front of my eyes. It was just amazing. I felt this almost physical, palpable sensation. And without even realizing it, in the back of my mind, all these forces kind of came together, and I think at that moment I kind of decided that this would be the next book, but it took me a while to kind of figure that out. And so it was my interest in history and politics and food kind of all coming together. And so I started doing some research, and what I discovered was that pretty much every president has a wonderful, interesting, quirky, bizarre food story of some kind. And so initially, I'd never written on the presidency before. I was a history major, but had never really written that much on professionally on this. And so there was just a vast amount of information about anything having to do with the White House. So the first job was to kind of winnow it down and decide which were the most compelling stories, who were the most interesting presidents, and what did they tell us about the nation, the president himself, and then ourselves. What does it tell us about, the state of the world, the state of the union? And I just started working away. I started doing some reporting. I went to some of the presidential homes, which is fabulous because, again, the history comes alive. I really recommend that to people. And I was deep into it when suddenly COVID hit. And I was laughing to myself when you guys were just talking with Rebecca because all the museums and libraries shut down, and I couldn't get access to the primary documents. And that was particularly important for the early presidents. The more recent presidents, there's quite a bit of information online, but the early presidents, it's a lot sparser. But by that point, I had accumulated a library of presidential and related food books. And then I had the great fortune of meeting a couple of people who really helped me a lot. The staff here at the National Museum of American History was helpful. They have a wonderful collection here that most people don't know much about. And a woman named Constance Carter at the Library of Congress, who I met when I was giving a Julia Child talk here in Washington, and she had met Julia and knew Julia and liked Julia, and I told her about this new project. So during COVID, she started sending me stuff that I would never have had access to otherwise, which was really helpful. And then I had other people helping me out. So it was kind of a collaborative effort, and it was COVID also affected the production. The book is supposed to be out now, but it's not coming out until President's Day, which is next February 2023. Because we simply couldn't get the books made. I mean, it's crazy that it's sort of a 19th century problem. They literally didn't have the paper or the printing presses or the trucks or whatever. So that gave me a little extra time to sort of fine tune things, which was a mixed blessing. I think it was actually a good thing in the end. We writers always want a little more time. And Knopf has done a beautiful job with this book, as they are wont to do. They gave me a 16-page color insert in the middle of the book. Each chapter starts with a black and white photo of the president in question. I ended up covering 26 of the 46 presidents for this book. To do them all would have been sort of ridiculous and encyclopedic, and actually not that interesting at the end of the day. So I really just tried to find the most interesting presidents from a gastronomic, but also from a food policy perspective. So as far as I know, there's no book quite like this. There have been plenty of recipes from the White House type books, or books about the presidency or various presidents. There's an old book called the White House Cookbook that's got recipes in it. That's just kind of a classic. It's got, squirrel stew and turtle soup and all those kinds of things that we don't eat any longer. And then there's a book by Poppy Cannon, who ran Ladies' Home Journal, which was had brief anecdotes with recipes, but nobody's done this book, which is really about the food of politics and the politics of food. And so I talk about food in personal terms because I think food tells you a lot about the individual, their tastes. Whether it's Thomas Jefferson, who was way ahead of his time. He was sort of the greatest epicure that we've had in the White House. went to France, was there during the Revolution as a U.S. ambassador, and came back with all sorts of wonderful wines and olive oils and barrels of olives and cheeses and so on. And he was very vegetable forward, as we now say. In his day, most people ate a lot of meat and a little bit of vegetables. But he was the other way around. And it's interesting that his diet is now becoming trendy again. Up to, Dwight Eisenhower, for example, who I sort of knew about in almost comic book terms. They were just the broad strokes. He was a general and he was a kind of a middle of the road Republican during the Cold War, but he's actually a really fascinating, much more fascinating guy than I realized, and was probably our best presidential cook, actually. He was taught to make, he'd catch trout or shoot grouse, and he was taught by an illiterate woodsman how to cook. He cooked for his family. When he was a general, he made sure that his troops were well fed. Napoleon always said an army marches on its stomach, and he believed that. He was briefly the president of Columbia University, and he made huge headlines because he gave the student cookbook group his own recipe for what he called 2-day soup, which was something his mother taught him to make, which I made for this book. I should add that there are recipes in my book also. Unfortunately, the 2-day soup recipe goes on, so I cut that, but it's pretty fabulous to make. It does take 2 days, and it requires a huge beef bone and tons of vegetables and barley and so on, and the whole house gets suffused with these amazing aromas. And then you've got all this soup. It takes you a week to eat, which is kind of fun. And then, someone like Ronald Reagan, who famously liked jelly beans, which seems like a trivial story, but actually is more complex when you start to peel back the layers, because the reason he started to eat jelly beans was he was trying to wean himself off of tobacco. And I get into the sugar industry and the candy industry. And then there's a political aspect to this, which was he was promoting jelly beans at the same time that he was cutting back on school lunches, and his administration declared that ketchup was a vegetable. And that combination set off a huge uproar, because the message was essentially, hey kids, little sugary sweets or sugary ketchup are more important than actual vegetables. And that set off a big debate. So these stories, and then it goes on and on, Jill Biden, for example, is a wonderful cook who grew up with an Italian grandparents who taught her to make pasta, and she loves to cook. And Kamala Harris is a wonderful cook too. She has cooking videos if you care to look online. Donald Trump famously is a meat and potatoes kind of a guy. But I find that these personal tastes tell us not only about the president himself and his family and his world that he comes from, but also the state of the nation. So I mentioned squirrel stew. That used to be something that some of the early presidents ate. And FDR loved a great delicacy of the day, which was terrapin soup, which is a brothy soup made of turtle, which is something we just generally don't eat any longer. William Howard Taft loved roasted possum, which is something that most people find unimaginable. I mean, you can find it down south now, but it was one of those things that was considered the height of haute cuisine back then, and people would send him possum from all across the country. And so it's the trends are interesting, because the president sets trends, but he also reflects trends. And then I built from the sort of the personal to the political and the diplomatic and the global. Food is the largest industry in America because it touches on everything from agriculture, obviously, but also chemicals of the petroleum industry. It touches on climate change. It touches on issues such as religion, or diplomacy, as I mentioned. Like, traditionally feasting has been used as a way of bringing people together. And I talked to some academics about these primal urges that we all have to eat together. It's a very deep drive that we have, to sit around and eat together, even if we don't like each other or we don't agree on certain things. The sort of the darker side of that is this favor bank that happens, where if you are a king or a president, and you give a feast, you are incurring debt. So the people who come to your feast then have to respond in some way, either by helping you out politically or by returning the feast. And so, if a president has a diplomat over to the White House for a state dinner, then the diplomat will very often immediately have the president over to their embassy to repay them. And it sounds old-fashioned, and it is in a very real way, because it goes back to early man and learning to cook with fire, which some academics who I talked to in the book argue changed the human brain and changed the way we socialize, because it freed up time and it made digestion easier. And then politically, if you're someone like Donald Trump, who likes to eat hamburgers, fast food burgers, he sent he was very shrewd about how he used food. He always said, "Oh, I operate from the gut," and he did. By presenting himself as a fast food president, as Bill Clinton notoriously did, but Trump embraced it, whereas Clinton kind of kept it as a secret, sort of. The message, the primal message that Trump was sending is that I like burgers, you like burgers, therefore we simpatico, vote for me. And that sounds simple, but it's really not. That people really relate to each other over food in a way that they don't over, say, what kind of shirt you're wearing or whatever. They might say, if you're wearing the same shirt, you might say, "Oh, nice shirt." But if you see somebody who's eating the same food as you are, it brings all sorts of associations to the table, and you sort of assume that you are on the same wavelength. And I think this goes back to the kind of tribal beginnings of of human culture, that you would share food around a fire. And it's subverbal, but it's very powerful. And wise politicians, like Thomas Jefferson or the Kennedys, or even Donald Trump, use that to their advantage. Less wise ones don't understand that, and they tend to bungle things. So anyway, I could keep going, but there's a lot of different facets to this subject. And so what I tried to do in writing the book was to have each president tell their story in a slightly different way, emphasize different aspects of the larger subject, and kind of give you a prismatic look at the subject of food and politics through the lens of the White House, which is, after all, the most famous house in the world. And it is, not only is it a symbol of the nation, it's an actual functioning home. And you forget that until you're walking down the hall and there's the First Lady, standing right there. So I say in the book that the White House is the most important home, or the most important house in the world, and therefore the foods that are eaten there are arguably among the most important in many ways. Anyway,
Yeah,
that was a long answer to your simple question.
I liked when the book started off, how you said walking through the halls of the White House for the first time and taking the tour and stopping and actually picturing and feeling all the memories of people eating meals there together. It really does. It brings a really personal touch to all the history, and you're right. And I think I know Miriam has a question for you also, but I think that one of the things that we've talked about in the last couple of years, especially since it's been a rough couple of years, is like what some people tend to want to talk about the things that separate us, but I always tend to try to talk about the things that do unite people. And we're lucky, we work in an industry with books, where books just naturally unite people. And so I feel like food is another thing that obviously literatively and figuratively bring people together. And so I like how you brought history into it too, because it's a really strong lesson, and it gets you to see the presidents on a more personal, like human level, especially ones that lived so long ago. And Miriam,
Yeah.
what question did you want to
Yeah, I wanted to ask because congratulations on the publication of your book first of all. And what I so appreciated in the early chapters were the many scenes around breaking bread, and where you had early on the fierce rivals Alexander Hamilton and James Madison there. And I guess just generally question throughout is how do you think food and drink sort of build a political consensus?
Well, as you said, I love the phrase "breaking bread" because it is really a primal thing that sort of it goes back to prehistory, and continues to be a driver today for bringing people together. I mean, you remember Obama's beer summit when he had Henry Louis Gates Jr. and the policeman who arrested him for trying to get into his own house, had them over to the White House for a beer. And it's sort of, I thought that was a scene that I had to cut from the book. There's a lot of great scenes I had to cut just because I was getting too long. But it's an example of something that's seemingly simple. Let's get a couple of guys together over a beer. But actually, it was important. And as Kelly was just saying, hey, look, we all have to eat, right? We're all human beings. We all have to eat. Like pickleball, food might be one of the few things we can all agree on, whatever our political persuasion is at the moment. So there's the physical act of consuming food, and it's a time when we sort of let our guard down, because our hands are busy doing this and we're trying to converse, and there's that aspect to it where there's sort of the interpersonal dynamics going on. But also if it's in a political context, a lot of backroom deals, so-called, were done over meals here in Washington, and still are. Less so now, partly because of COVID, partly because everything has become hyper-partisan now. But I argue in the book that we've got to return to the traditional model because it's more efficient and it gets things done, and we're not squabbling all the time. Let's all pull our chairs up to the national table and sit down and break bread together. That's the answer to move forward instead of just throwing food at each other, as it were. So I love this subject because it's something that we can all relate to, and yet I think there are a lot of really fun anecdotes that I can bring to the table with this book, and also. My secret agenda here, in part, is to, I want to entertain and inform, but I really want people who, especially young people who might think that history is boring or that politics don't matter. I want to try to bring them in through the lens of food to the larger conversation about America. And I hope that is something that appeals to libraries. I would say that it's a kind of a natural at this point in history to have this kind of coming together. It seems to me, food is now a very popular subject, as we all know, and there's this 24/7, 365 food juggernaut out there, the celebrity chef phenomenon, but also more and more people learning to cook or going out to eat or paying attention to their health. All of these things come into play. And ultimately, as Anthony Bourdain always said, nothing is more political than food. So, if you can seduce people with beautiful quesadillas or platters of sushi or even a simple grilled cheese sandwich, whatever it is, then you can get into a more nuanced conversations about a lot of other things. So that's my little secret agenda, is to kind of seduce people or lure them in to a bigger conversation.
Yes, as a mom, I always appreciate the tricking your children into learning something. That's always something I very much appreciate.
Exactly.
Miriam, did you have another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, in addition to the presence of Julia Child in the book, you also make mention of Alice Waters as the leader of the Delicious Revolution in Berkeley, who really kind of helped shift the us into a new politics of food.
Yeah, for sure. I know Alice a little bit. She is an amazing kind of visionary. And she was talking about having a White House garden, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. She grew up with a Victory Garden in her parents' house in New Jersey. And she learned to cook in France. She opened Chez Panisse in Berkeley, which was a kind of a politicized food environment, I guess you could call it. It was very communal, but they had an agenda, not only delicious food, but sort of a set of moral beliefs. And she has had a kind of behind the scenes role, which I actually talk about it quite a bit in the book. She not only did things like change the menu at Jefferson's home, Monticello, where there's a cafe for visitors, which was a sort of standard cafe. And she came in and she thought, Jefferson was our great foodie, our first foodie. How could we have this standard fare? We ought to be using stuff from all these wonderful gardens here at Monticello. So that's now become like a farm to table restaurant, which is great. More importantly, she has reached out to the White House and gotten other well-known cooks from across the country and other kitchen workers, and has put some pressure on the White House to take food more seriously, to raise the profile of the executive chef. Some of those efforts backfired, but some of them succeeded. As one of her friends told me, some people roll their eyes at Alice because she's got this dreamy way about her, but she actually gets a lot done. And so I think she was one of the main voices that helped to inspire the Obamas to do their garden, but also the Clintons. And she certainly, the current executive chef at the White House is a Filipino woman, Christetta Comerford, who is a very accomplished cook. She was originally hired by the George W. Bushes. First time a woman and a person of color has been, at least in the modern era, an executive chef. The executive chef, by the way, is a title that was created by Jackie Kennedy. She was the one that had the sort of grand vision for the modern entertaining in the modern White House. And so she created the position of executive chef. She elevated that role. She elevated the food. She elevated the entertaining. And she very consciously patterned her agenda on Louis XIV's court in France. And he very shrewdly used food as a political tool, as did she and Jack. And they had these incredible evenings at the White House. I tell this wonderful story about Leonard Bernstein being at the White House that you'll have to read about, because you get the sense of the magic of the Kennedy days, Camelot, and then the great sort of breaking down upon Jack's assassination. But they very consciously used food and entertainment to political ends. And they were very, very successful. And so it's just fascinating to see that some people intuitively understand this dynamic and others learn it and others simply don't get it. So Alice Waters was sort of whispering in the ears of the people at the White House for many years. Currently, she's pulled back from that, and she is more focused on what she calls the edible schoolyard, which is teaching kids how to not only grow their vegetables and care for them, but also to cultivate and cook them. And it's a wonderful program.
That was a good question. And so I think we are pretty much running out of time, but this was such a fascinating conversation. I feel like we could ask you a million more questions. We did have a question from one of our other colleagues that I wanted to ask you, but one thought I had was that, my gosh, I forgot now, it just went out of my head. Wait a minute, I just wanted to ask you something. Oh, I know. When I was reading a little bit about the snippet, and only because it's very timely, I just wanted to ask. I know that you have a lot of access to a lot of Julia Child's old archives and stuff like that. And I thought it was interesting when she was talking about the Queen's visit to the White House. It kind of puts everything in perspective again. I mean, how many years ago that was, the fact that the Queen lived such a long life. I remember in the book you mentioned, or in the part that I read, that Captain and Tennille played for the Queen. Interesting choice. I just wondered if you had any other little snippets about that era or about that event, because I just think it'd be something that we'd all be interested in hearing about.
Sure. Well, I actually wrote a little story about that for the White House Historical Association's Quarterly, which they did a special edition on the Platinum Jubilee for Queen Elizabeth. And it came out right before she died, so it's interesting. And yeah, I mean, that event, 1976, was a really big deal. And Julia wasn't that impressed by most celebrities. And in fact, I mentioned there was this big rainstorm that happened right before the event. But there were other moments that didn't quite work. She thought that Captain and Tennille were very unqueenly, she said. And kind of cheap. And it was Ford trying to make a political point, reaching out to a younger constituency. And Bob Hope's jokes weren't very good. And this went wrong and that went wrong. The presenters were never given any food or wine, so they were sitting in the back, frustrated. But Julia said that the Queen was one of the very few celebrities that she was very pleased to meet and see. I don't know if she actually met the Queen. I know she met Prince Philip. One doesn't really meet the Queen. I don't know, unless you're the president. But she was a fan of the Queen, let's put it that way. And being in proximity of the Queen, you're not allowed to film the Queen or the president eating. So what they would do for these television shows was they would do all sorts of footage about what's happening behind the scenes, down in the kitchen, or what the White House looks like now under this administration. And so they did film people coming into the dinner and then leaving, and then a little bit about the entertainment that night, and then they would fill it in with these sort of documentary shorts. I recommend the one from 1967. It's called White House Red Carpet. It's in black and white, and I think you can find it online through WGBH or PBS. It's really great. I recommend it. Julia's got this black and white kind of fashionable coat on, and she's got a kind of a bouffant. I think it might be a wig, actually. But she's very charming, and it's a kind of a great slice of time. And she takes you down not only into the back stairwells, but also into the actual kitchen down on the ground floor, which is quite small at the White House. And it's amazing that they can produce these huge dinners on this tiny kitchen. And the chef then, Henry Holler, was a Swiss guy who was highly competent. He served 5 presidents, longest tenure yet. And they became buddies. And he was still there in 1976 when she went back for the second time. She was impressed by the quality of the food, Johnson was famous for liking Pedernales chili and ribs, but the food at his state dinners was top notch, and Julia made sure everybody knew about that. And she made it kind of a mission of hers to go out and kind of proselytize for the White House and to say, hey, look, we should pay attention to what our leaders are eating, and they ought to make a bigger effort. They ought to be more like the French presidents who go to dinners and you get the menu for it, and people are really into the details of it, and they use it as a way to promote local agriculture and wine. And why not continue that here? And I agree with her, and I amplify that in my book. And I also sort of at the end of the book, I have a little pitch for elevating the kitchen itself, bringing it out of the basement and into the light, as it were. And the reality is that I think that for years the White House cooks were overlooked, but now we're at a new moment where people really appreciate food, and that the kitchen itself ought to be somewhat more on display as a way of bringing the public to the White House, and demonstrating these high level of cooking, the best of American ingredients. And so it's a slight provocation that I throw in at the end to sort of stir up the conversation, because I think this is important, and we're at a different moment in time now. So
I agree.
that's my
Well,
final
thank you
thought.
so much for being with us today. That was really fun, and we've all learned so much. And I think, even if I'm a self-proclaimed terrible cook, but I love to eat, and I love to eat good food, and I appreciate it. And Miriam and I certainly like to go out to eat together, and we always appreciate good food and good wine. Last question, one of our colleagues wanted to ask, and maybe this is a good one to go out on, is if you had one of the presidents, after all your research, if you had one president you could sit down and dine with, you know what? Let's base it on the food, not the president, but on just the food. Who would you have picked, or did you come up with an answer for that?
Oh, that's a good question. There are many ways to answer that, because there's some presidents who I didn't like really, but I'm sort of fascinated by them and their food. Such as someone like Calvin Coolidge, who was this Yankee from Vermont who had very strange eating habits. I'd be curious to see him, but really, if it comes down to the food, I would have to say Thomas Jefferson, because he was a man ahead of his time, and he was such a complicated person. He wrote a lot about how we're all created equal, and yet he was a slaveholder. His personal chef was James Hemings, who was a slave, but who was 3/4 white, and he brought Hemings over to Paris and trained him to cook under some of the best kitchens in Paris. And Hemings, was a very, very accomplished cook, and Jefferson was a very accomplished eater, and he led this kind of fabulous life, but there were a lot of contradictions. So in terms of conversation and food, I think he would be the one. But I know I would love, pretty much
Lots of
any of them.
questions
They're
to
all
ask him.
interesting people. They really are.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think
And there would
that's
definitely
one thing
be a
that,
lot of questions to ask him, but I think you'd at least be enjoying the food and the wine at the same time. So that's
yeah,
that's
exactly. And Calvin Coolidge might not have said anything. He was known as Silent Cal. So
Yeah, and I loved how ice cream was such a fascinating food when it
ice
first came
cream.
out. It was
Jefferson
really
brought
fun.
ice cream from Paris. Yeah, and
Yeah,
Hemings knew how to
so
make it. Yeah, no, it's amazing. And actually, Joe Biden is known for his love of ice cream. So that has not left the American diet,
I hope it
unlike
never does.
squirrel stew.
I think
So
that's a win for us at least.
yeah, I think so. I think we're ahead of game here. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for, getting the train and getting there on time and talking to us from the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. after the whole program just seemed to fit so nicely together. So we really appreciate your time. Good luck with the book. We can't wait for it to come out. We understand, especially librarians understand the delays the last couple of years, but I think it'll even make the book more appreciated. So thank you so much for being here today. So nice to meet you.
Well, you're welcome, and bon appetit.
There you go. Everyone go have something good to eat. Have a
Yeah,
great day,
exactly.
everybody.
I
Thank
hope
you
you're all
so
hungry.
much.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
Alex.